Soldering the box. We are, as you guessed it, we're going to be constructing the box. And if you don't see this demo, you're probably going to do this the wrong way because you don't solder it together like you might think. There's a certain sequence that I want you to follow that we've come up with in the past 10 years of doing this project. So, watch carefully. First, construct the lid top. And it's a good idea to use your box sides to set them up so that you know that they're the same size as your box sides. So I'll just put that up here. And if they're much larger, you might run into some problems. So you solder the front, you solder the back, you tin your edges. And if you don't know what tinning is, this is tinning. You take solder and you coat the edges. It's just a thin coat. You're not adding any solder like you would on your solder seams here. These, you want to have a bead, a raised, rounded solder seam, nice and smooth on both sides. Wash this off, get all your numbers off, okay? Then you're going to tin all of your edges of your pieces. You do this beforehand so that you don't have to tin the inside of the box. This is a real pain in the you-know-what, and it's easier to tin your pieces beforehand and then construct it rather than, afterward. So then we construct the lid sides and the box sides. And I'll show you how you do this. You do this in pairs. You'll set up 2 at a time right in the corner here. And this is a good opportunity for you to learn how to solder something with one hand, and to hold something in place with the other. That's a really good skill, especially if you're going to go on into stained glass too and do other things in stained glass. Whenever you're soldering anything together three-dimensionally, it needs to be corner to corner like this. If you look, corner to corner, so just that inside edge is touching. And that's the way all of the soldering should go whenever you're doing any kind of three-dimensional project. It goes together that way. So you set it up that way very carefully, make sure that just the edge touches, they don't overlap. If they overlap, this is not going to fit together right. The way this pattern was designed, everything has to go together corner to corner, including the top and the bottom. So I've already done these sides, and I'll do the very last for you. Make sure that whatever side you want facing out, especially if there's a texture, is facing out. So if you're using glue chip or if you're using any kind of special glass that has a texture, make sure it's facing out, as well as the kind of glass that you're using. If you're using a certain kind of glass that has a certain pattern on one side, even if it's smooth on both sides, make sure they're both facing out. So, sorry, bumped the camera there. Pick up a little solder and you hold the iron right there. And the solder will drip right down that seam, and that's okay. It doesn't have to bubble right at the top there. And it should hold it together with just a little bit of solder. On these box sides pieces, they're a little bit longer, so you can turn them over and do the other side. And very gently, if you need to just slightly pull them a little bit together, you can. But any more, if you have to really, really maneuver them, you might rip the foil. And so just be really careful when you're doing this because the foil's very delicate on there. So I've got it tacked. And if you look, there's just a little bit of solder there and a little bit of solder there. Do not solder everything together. You're just tacking it at this point. Reason being is if we do this incorrectly, we need to be able to untack. So then we're going to assemble the sides and the lid sides like this, so that you're going to have 2 squares. And so you can flux all your corners, or excuse me, the corners that you need to attach, and they go together the same way. You just put them together and tack as best as you can, and they should sit flat right on your jig. Tack again, and do the same thing over here with these. Some people like to drop solder on there. Some people like to pick up a little dab of solder from one of these little pellets that are just sitting around on the table, and that's okay. On these, you only really have to tack them once because they're so short that they'll just be held together by one tack. This is the most important part of this, and this is the reason why so many people do this wrong, is they'll assemble this entire box bottom, and then they'll try and do the lid top, and then when they go to put them together, they don't fit. So what we're doing here is we're making sure that all different ways your box lid will fit on. If you cannot do this, check all of these edges again and untack it, and then move them out a little bit if you need to. When you're untacking, all you do is you're just holding them. I'm putting pressure with these two fingers here and holding this away, and I'm using the barrel of the iron, and I'm just gonna hold it right there and then push them apart, just like that. And so then you can set it right back down, move them however you need to, and then tack again, retack. And then check one more time to make sure that they're properly, that they're spaced okay, that the lid will go on with a little bit of space to move. Okay, and I'm having problems. Okay, that should work. Okay, so now, again, make sure that it's fitting properly. Now, it's just tacked, so now you can move ahead and you can tack the box bottom on there. I strongly suggest doing the box bottom first. You can do this first step of tacking the bottom onto the bottom, the top onto the top, but I strongly suggest that you solder all of your box bottom first, because there's the least amount of error. Most people did a pretty good job on this. Most people, they try really hard. We try and emphasize craftsmanship on this one. Anytime you're doing a three-dimensional project, you want to have really good craftsmanship because it makes your soldering job a whole lot easier. It'll go by a lot quicker with less hassle. And put your lid top on here. When you're tacking, don't tack on the corners because you don't want to untack accidentally any of your sides. Not that you would, but can't be too careful. So what I'm doing is I'm just holding it at an angle, just like that, and that's what's holding it on. And so you should still get those corners. You get these corners in here. That's the way it gets soldered. Now this is not my box. This is left over from somebody, so I cannot attest for the craftsmanship on this. So if there are gaps, it's not my fault. When you're soldering, you're going to be using one of these things that's conveniently called, and I don't know, kind of scarily called a wedgie. Yes, a wedgie. Not the wedgie that you know and fear, but it is a wedgie. And it's designed specifically to put three-dimensional things on to solder. When you're doing this, you may consider stuffing some paper towel in here, just a little bit, you know, just probably, I don't know, 6-7 inches of paper towel wadded up in there. That'll help catch the solder that may fall through if you have gaps. And so the way you're doing this, you're going to prop it on the 45, and this, there's a sequence here. You're going to do 2 runs of solder, 2 runs of solder. The first run of soldering is going to be to close in the gaps. And so I'll show you here how that goes. And the best way to do this is to hold this so that your soldering iron is in your dominant hand, and it should be, always. But you're just going to feed the solder right on the iron and just go right across like this. And this is not the kind of solder seam that you want. This is just a real flat, just a straight beveled edge that just goes right flat there. That's not the kind of solder seam that we want. We're going to want a beveled bead, a raised and rounded solder seam, but that's the second way through. So the first seam that you do on the entire box is that flat edge. All right, so you're just feeding the solder right on that edge. When you're doing these sides, you prop it up just like this. All right, you always want to be right on top of the solder seam. So the solder seam, the seam forms a V. So that's what I mean, the V.